All right. Hey, folks, this is Mike from the Battles of the First World War podcast, and we are back. And today we are having a third roundtable discussion of the French army during World War I, and we're going to be taking a look at the French army at the beginning of the war in 1914. This is something that in the course of the podcast we haven't really gotten into, so I'm super excited to listen to today's discussion. Once again, we are with some of the best Great War historians in the field today. With me this evening are Christina Holstein, author of several incredible guides to the Verdun battlefield, amongst other published works and articles. Steve Marsdin, a student and researcher of the 1914 Battle of the Frontiers and its effects. And Jim Smithson, author of A Taste of Success, the First Battle of the Scarpe, the opening phase of the Battle of Arras, 9 to 14 April 1917, as well as two guidebooks on the Arras battlefields. And again, I just feel this is the right thing to do. We offer a hearty thanks to Alex Lyons, whose idea these discussions originated from. So Alex will join us again for later episodes as we get deeper into the war. And I know he's challenged us to mention his great-grandfather's regiment, so I'll do it and go ahead and get it out of the way for everybody. It was the 315th Régiment d'Infanterie. So there we go. There you go, Alex. Again, we have an excellent group here, and as always, you must please forgive me for anything that may happen technically. So we'll go ahead and get started. And just before we start our discussion, I just want to give the listeners out there a quick breakdown of French units. We were just discussing this. So if I make any mistakes, please, folks, go ahead and correct me. A battalion coming in at about 4 infantry companies. A battalion of infantry was about 1,000 men. A regiment was 3 battalions coming in at about 3,000 men. We're talking full strength here, okay? 2 regiments made a brigade. 2 brigades made a division numbered around 12,000 men. And then 2 divisions made a corps. So anything bigger than that, you're getting into talking about field armies, and field armies, of which we will no doubt be talking about today, those depended on the mission and the availability of soldiers. So the sizes between the 4th, 5th, and 1st and 3rd armies, those are all very much different, just like in the German army. So with that, we'll go ahead. I'd like to begin the discussion today by looking at the French army in the summer of 1914 as war is declared. So in 1914, how ready was the French army for a conflict with Germany?
I think we'd all probably agree that they weren't, but that's not very much for discussion.
They thought they were, didn't they? They thought they were.
Okay.
I think they thought, I'm not sure Joff did. Joff Barleycamps thought they needed another year to 2 years to be at the peak, but it didn't have that choice. I think they were more, they thought they were better than they were. I think that's true, but no, they weren't ready for a conflict against Germany. For a conflict in their colonies, they were more than capable of holding their own, but to fight a modern industrial army, I don't think they were. Okay.
And why not, Steve?
Well, I think this could pick up on Jim's points he made in one of the early episodes. It's due to all the infighting, not only in the French army, but in French society as a whole, and politics, French politics as well. That had always been there, but during the latter part of the 19th century, and certainly the first part of the 20th century, it got worse. And at the time when the French army needed to get everything in order, it itself was divided. So at the time of the Belle Epoque, the middle classes aren't going to pay for military expenditure, increase their taxation because they're having a good life. The working class, with the rise of the socialist movement and sort of the military suppression, the Vigneron riots in the south of France, they're not going to support the army. So it's like when I said, the politicians didn't provide the funds or the backing for what the army needed, but the army, its part, didn't present a united front with Dreyfus, anti-clericalism, Masonic influences. They were riven. So if the politicians, because of the general society conditions, aren't doing what we want, you need to prevent a united front to go to them and say, look, this is what we need. And they couldn't do that. So the French army was falling behind and behind. They knew, or at least certain individuals knew what was needed, but there wasn't the political will or the pressure from the army to get that done. I think that there are examples of that, but I'll let the others come in first and see what they think about that.
Yeah, you're very right on that one. And I think one of the major effects it had that I see is that lack of cohesion led to a lack of real quality and especially staff training in the way that the Germans were doing all the way up to the start of the war. So you'd have a situation, and just to explain to anybody who's not quite sure about, staff officers are basically the ones who take the orders out there. A commander may make decisions, but it's a staff officer that will, at different levels, all the way from the general HQ, all the way down through the armies and then corps and then divisions, and even at battalion, regimental level. They're the people who will organise all the orders, interpret what the commander wants, and actually send out the orders to the troops to get that actually carried out. And unless you have a lot of training and practice in that, and the British Army was very much the same, unless you practice that, it doesn't work when it hits the actual warfare. You may think you've got it all sorted out. Theoretically, you may think you know what you're going to be doing. All the people going through staff college and so on learn all the basics of this. But when you hit the real sort of thing and you're actually under pressure and the decisions have to be made quickly and commanders make decisions, but then all those commands have to go out properly. And the French had not really got that structure. They hadn't trained in that way. I think Steve and probably Steve and I have mentioned before, they didn't have large-scale exercises, many large-scale exercises before the war. They had not got the terrain or the infrastructure to carry out those large-scale corps level, where whole divisions would be moved around the countryside, pretending to fight each other. It doesn't matter that it all seems to be pretend. It's not really an exercise for the men on the ground. It's not that the infantry and so on learn, or the artillery learn a deal about those. What it's for are staff officers. So that when a commander says, I want that division to move over that way, all the orders go out to make it happen. And I think that was really lacking. The Germans had done that to a T. They had a professional staff that had trained quite well and trained very well, in fact, before the war. So as the war sort of went full scale, the Germans, in a way, could put that into action. Everything went, not clockwork, nothing ever does when you get into conflict, but it worked a heck of a lot better. And much of the problems that the French had, and we're going to talk about that later on, in those first weeks of the war, much of it could be actually put down, not, as we're going to talk about, to this idea that the French were just throwing themselves at the Germans willy-nilly, but that was an impression that came mainly because of the lack of actual control that was carried out by both leadership and staff. So that's another element that I think is where the French were less ready than the Germans. Christina, I don't know what you're thinking about on that.
Well, I just wonder, on a sort of purely human level, if you've gone through things like the Dreyfus, which absolutely, I mean, the army was completely riven in two over Dreyfus. And then you've got all the trouble with the Masons and General André and the Affaire des Fiches and all that. On a purely human level, how do you work with people who have been on the opposite side to you for what, 10, 15 years? I mean, all the senior commanders who were junior at the time of Dreyfus, how do they actually manage to put that behind them and work together? What happens to the personal rivalries that there must have been? And more than the rivalries, the real dislikes and hatreds. How do they put that aside? Can they put it aside? I mean, is that also a factor at the beginning until the urgency of the situation really bears down on them, and they can and it becomes unimportant. But I just don't see how they, how they just put it behind them and got on together. But as something, I don't know. Nobody ever writes about it, so I don't know. But they were. I mean, when you read that this one was pro-Dreyfus and his, his chief of staff was anti, I just think, how does that work?
Yeah,
I mean, Dreyfus must have been like a Twitter row, a mega Twitter row, mustn't it? If you see what I mean. And in society and within the army, I don't know. I just wonder if it was a factor.
Yeah, but particularly when they haven't had the chance to work together in training exercises and overcome those. I mean, just to pick on a point that Jim said, because my own opinion, it's the singular most thing that affected the French performance is that lack of training areas. What did they know that lack? There was that missing element. In 1897, a training program was approved for each French corps area. So France is divided into 21 or 22 military regions, and each provides an army corps. Each one was to have a corps-sized training area. On top of that, there would be 3 larger areas where they could practice even more larger-scale manoeuvres with artillery and all sorts of things involved. That was passed in 1897. By 1911 or 1912, when Joffre came in, they still only had 2 corps-size areas and 2 even smaller ones. The Germans, each army corps had its own area, plus on top of that, there were 3 even bigger areas for the artillery to practice as well. So they knew what was needed, but there just wasn't the will to put that in place. And for example, I've written it down because I've got a memory like a sieve. Between 1897 and 1909, there were 12 changes of war minister. Between 1901 and 1913, there wasn't a single year that Germany didn't spend more than 50% more than France on armaments and its military. And that decade plus, you can't get it back. But it's not just the military's fault. I think the prime book stops at the politicians. But it's like anything else. The modern day comparisons as well. The military always wants more. The politicians always want to spend less. Until there's a conflict or a threat of a conflict, the two don't converge. So in this case, it was a Moroccan crisis, 1911, I think. And after that, bringing Joffre, he starts trying to put things in place. But by 1914, it wasn't completely in place. And Joffre may have been sort of the head guy, but he still didn't have overall control. So, for example, if he wanted a new piece of artillery, it wasn't Joffre that said, we'll have a new piece of artillery. He may have expressed his wishes, but there was a department of artillery at the War Ministry that liaised with the artillery regiments. And it was that sort of dysfunctionality which made it very difficult. Similarly, like I think Jim touched on, some of the commanders weren't up to it. Joffre knew a lot of them weren't up to it, but he couldn't get rid of them because the only way up until late the 3rd week of August 14, he could get rid of a commander was if he physically wasn't up to it. For incompetence, he couldn't get rid of them without the acquiescence of this Conseil Supérieur de Guerre. So you had to go through all the committee sort of stages. Given that there were no training areas, or very few training areas, there was limited opportunity where he could prove that the commanders weren't up to it to get rid of them before war started. Thankfully, by, I think, August the 15th, after the seriousness of the situation, he was allowed then, a special decree was passed by the government, that Joffre could get rid of commanders on his own without having to refer it to a third party. And that's when the process started to speed up of replacing people, obviously, which continued and sped up after the 22nd with the Mougeage.
I think
you mentioned. Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
On the that thing about the politics, I mean, I don't think that's stressed enough, and I know that Goyle's book is very good on that in terms of he identifies that this idea of a war minister that changes so often, and the fact that that person is in a sense totally in charge of a military, even though often they were not military men, and that goes all the way back to the fear that the Republic had about the army. And about the fear that they had. And that's what people forget, that the French have just gone through this century of changes from from a royalty to a republic, back to a royalty to all sorts of things. And this republic did not sit on very stable ground. It feared an army coup. We sort of look at it and laugh about the thought of an army coup, but it did not want the army to be some central, almost self-organizing body and self-working body. It wanted an overall control over it at the highest of levels, which is the Minister of War, which is fine if you've got somebody who's there who's A, military, and B, stays there for more than a year, which didn't happen. So all this lack of cohesion is why they weren't really ready. And all the things that Christina said about the fact that when you have all the infighting, you don't have this coherent body of people. And also it means that people rise to the top for the very wrong reasons.
Yeah.
And that's why you have the absolute, if you excuse the phrase, idiots who should never have been commanding at Army Corps level, who were there in August and were not there by September. And it is, and we're going to see that later on today, I think, incredible how different the French army began to function when you go into the month of September. August and September are very different beasts. And a lot of that is down to the fact that people who were just simply divisional commanders or even brigade commanders suddenly found themselves at corps level or higher and at divisional level when they were brigade. The people who could do the job suddenly found themselves in powerful positions and being able to do the job. And all of a sudden, things got very much more coherent. So, yeah.
I would say...
I was just going to say, I think Jim's just described Britain and Europe. When you're talking about people appointed to top jobs in the military who haven't got any experience. After all, we've all seen that over the last few years. But in Germany, didn't they call it an army with a country attached?
Yes.
Rather than a country with an army attached. Yes. I mean, Britain's always been afraid of the military either. That's why we've always had a very small standing army, and we've also always had politicians in charge, and they've always kept the military on a very tight string, and the Navy. I mean, that's. There's a reason you can understand it, except that when the trouble hits the fan, then you need people who really know what they're doing, and that's when you've got the politicians in charge who may well not know at all what they're doing. And certainly, I would agree with what Jim's saying about the way things changed between August and September. But the trouble is, an awful lot of men have died by then. That's what's so shocking about August 1914, isn't it? Or this, while people are cutting their teeth, as it were, people are dying, and enormous numbers of men are dying in August 1914 on the German side as well, actually.
I think it's one of the best examples of training and importance of training. It's like anything, be it sport, which obviously life's not on the line, but the opening game of the season, the best trained, the best prepared team will win the opening encounter. This is the opening encounter of the war. The best trained team is going to... I would suggest that the disparity between the French and German armies was the greatest in August 14 than at any point during the war. And the results showed that. But like anything else in life, I mean, obviously Jim's from a teaching background, you learn very quickly on the job if you have to do it, particularly if your life depends on it. And as I think the point you made, Christine, one of the other previous of it, they learnt on the job, and by September time, plus other things as well, they were performing a lot better.
And sometimes it can be a bad thing to win the opening encounter, can't it? Because then you think, oh, right, look, we can do this, so we don't need to rethink what we're doing. I've just been reading about this completely non-battle at Noailles, near Longuyon, 24th of August, 1914. I mean, it's a place I used to drive through, so it's somewhere I like. Well, I mean, it was a battle of absolutely no importance, but this account been a year later, the general who commanded this unit says there's far too much movement as if they were on the parade ground. They should not be doing that. It looks good on the parade ground, but when you're on the battlefield, this is not the way to do it. And I thought, well, that's interesting. 3 weeks into the war, he's saying, the battalion commanders should not be maneuvering men like that. And you have to think more about what you're doing and take decisions on the spot rather than just take decisions that, you learnt in training. Well, the French, the French weren't doing that. I mean, they were just learning. I haven't come across any accounts of the very early days of the war. Anybody says they're doing it as they did in training. They're just working out how to do it as best they can.
The bottom line is most of them hadn't been trained.
And yeah, that's right. They're particularly the reservists. Yeah, absolutely not.
And
just on an interesting thing I thought of in terms of readiness, I don't think the Germans were ready for this war either. They thought that, and as Christina said, they thought they were, but I don't think they were. They thought that sort of success they had in August 14 would be it.
Yeah.
The same way as 1870 and 71, that they would, as long as they rolled over the French army in the first place, very near Paris, everything would just come to the French would just collapse. I think their idea was you win this major battle at the beginning, and that's it, you've won the war. And their great surprise, and all the accounts you read, is the shock of the German army when the French actually turned round and held on and counterattacked, all on the line. And they were just shocked. They just thought they're just retreating. They'll keep retreating. We've won the war. All good. Because they didn't understand the scale of what this war was. Nobody did. No. I mean, see, it's so easy for us in hindsight to think, of course it's a big war. Of course it's going to go on a long time. They didn't think that. I don't think the Germans were ready for the type of war that we eventually saw. Nobody was. But they were more prepared for it.
Everything's relative to the French.
But they were, in relative to the French, they were prepared for the early battles. But then. But
they were prepared for something that was going to be over in 6 weeks, weren't they? They weren't prepared for something that was going to last for 4 years. I mean, as you say, nobody was.
No,
but
exactly.
the idea, this extraordinary idea of marching through Belgium and swinging around west of Paris, surely only comes from having won the Franco-Prussian War and thinking that was easy, we can do it again. And that's always a mistake, isn't it? To underestimate the enemy. There's a distinct underestimation of the French there. Well, fair enough. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, there was no reason to overestimate them, but even so, that's a plan that was just never going to work, was it?
No. And if it doesn't work in those opening weeks,
it's never going to work.
You put all your reserves in the front line to maximise the numerical advantage. By the time, as Jim, we're going to talk about, when we get to first team, they haven't got that experienced reserve to put into the front. They bring in young troops and people that aren't really up to the job at hand.
Yeah, there are writers who will regard the German army as being very elite at this time, and that's why they were rolling over the French to start off with. But that depth, Stephen, is really an important one. And to say that they had the type of fighting in their grasp by then is refuted totally by what happens at first team, where you have exactly the same sort of attacks going on that the French are all criticised for so heavily in August. But even the Germans haven't learned from that. They haven't seen what happened there and thought, we can't do that. It's going to just be a disaster. So that's, again, that whole idea about readiness is respected of where they were at any one particular time. None of the Germans were either.
Speaking of of being ready, maybe thinking a bit on the strategic level. I'm not quite sure who made the comment in our community Google document here, but this talk about the importance of defending the Lorraine Iron Basin. Can anyone speak to that? And why wasn't that area properly defended?
Well, that's something, that is something I really wonder about. Yeah, I mean, that just seems extraordinary. You'd think after the Russo-Japanese War they would have realized the importance of iron and steel. I mean, most of the Lorraine Iron Basin was in France. Some of it was in occupied, in annexed Lorraine, but the big part of it was in France. And it was fantastically productive, and the most productive mines were on either side of the border. Now, Briey is about 2 kilometers from the border, I think, and the guns at Longwy fired right down into the mines at Longwy and in the valley running up into Luxembourg and Belgium. And I mean, when you look at the siege train that the Germans brought up to deal with Longwy, you think, for goodness sake, this is an old Vauban fortress. Why on earth do you need that sort of a siege train for it? Why can't you just pinch it out, move on and let someone else deal with it? But nope, they had to smash it because they were afraid the guns would destroy the mines and the superstructures and the iron and steel works down below. The French didn't fire a shot in that direction. It just seems extraordinary. And there was no intention to develop it at all. The idea was to attack into the Reichsland, and that's it. We're going to attack, and the war's going to be over. So we don't need to do that. But it's an absolute disaster for France, losing the Brie Iron Basin and of course the coal area around Charleroi. And in 1915. The Germans were, when they were looking ahead to when we've won and what we're going to do, to annexing the whole of the Lorraine Basin and, of course, all the coal area in northern France, so they could, keep their industry going. But I don't believe the war would have gone on for so long if the French had considered defending it and then had found a way of doing it. I mean, obviously, you've got to find a way of doing it. But no, it wasn't even discussed. And when there was the inquiry held to look into why not in 1915, which actually in 1919, which was held very quickly, didn't seem to me to come to any conclusion at all. And then, in fact, Messimy said that nobody had ever made him aware of the importance of it before the war, which just seems extraordinary, doesn't it? When it really were producing 83% of the French needs in iron ore.
I wanted to ask
in 1914. Yeah. I mean, it's just they're 62% of their steel. I think 60% of their iron and 83% of the iron ore. I mean, it was just extraordinary, and yet nothing was done. I mean, Brie was occupied on the 4th of August, and then the Germans moved. They left, then they came back on the 8th, and they stayed. That's it. So that whole area just passed into German hands without a shot fired in its defense, and it just seems extraordinary to me that the importance of it was not considered at all. But I suppose if all you're going to do is to attack, then, you're not going to need it because the war isn't going to last that long.
Back at what Christina said, obviously, Germany was sufficient at the beginning of the war in coal, but what it wasn't self-sufficient is iron ore. And by the fact that they could extract the iron ore from the Longwy-Brie Basin, it made them self-sufficient in iron ore as well. So it was not only a major loss to the French losing 83% of their own supply, it was a major gain for the Germans. I mean, there is a bit of a conspiracy theory, or there was just after the war, which is one of the reasons for the Brie inquiry, was that had the industrialists didn't want their own mines destroying or their own factories destroying, or that, and therefore they didn't want the army to attack, so they could just go and reoccupy them straight away. But I don't think that had any real validity. But what is interesting, and Christina pointed that Messimy claiming that he didn't know that it was so important. Well, if a politician said that in the last round of office, the politician should have said to the army, look, this is important to our industrial base. What are you going to do about it? Yes, it's very hard to defend, but it's on the border. You've got sitting a long way at one end, but nothing much else. But the army just never bothered, never even. All the army planning was the Meuse Heights, and that. When they were going to build the Mersian green metric between Montbéliard to Bar-le-Duc and Commercy, the army was against it time and again because they thought it might help the Germans when they advanced if they ever advanced into France. They didn't sort of say, "Oh, this is an opportunity. We'll build more a network further east so we can." Station more men at the front and resupply them better. They were always thinking away from that front. There's no sort of defensive pattern for it, or certainly no plans for attack. But that I can perhaps understand because there's the Moselle Stellung just to the other side of it there. Their doctrine of offensive wasn't just defending a war of movement. They didn't want to be bashing their heads against a brick wall or fortifications because they weren't geared up for it. And you can't change your doctrine overnight. But regardless of what the army think, it's the politicians that just said, look, 83% of our iron ore we want this, you do your damnedest to make sure it doesn't fall into enemy hands. And if it does, make sure they can't get the iron ore out, destroy the mines or whatever. But there we go.
But do remember that when it came to the plan of Joffre's attack, as he was going to do with all of 1st to 4th armies, his idea was that he could attack with 1st and 2nd into Lorraine, which is basically coming from the southern part of that area, and 3rd and 4th will be coming from the northern end of that. He would have pinched out all of that area. So in some respects, losing it in the first few days, and this is what Christina's right in terms of saying it's almost like the Germans thought that by just doing the Schlieffen plan, they'd win the war. They didn't have to think on a long-term basis. There's no long-term thinking. Yeah. So anybody who mentioned the Joffre, well, what about the iron ore there? He would have said, no, don't worry about that. When we've attacked from the south and the west, we basically, any Germans who have gone in there, we'll pocket. And if he was told about defending it, if he hadn't been attacking, it would have been the same sort of pocket created by the Germans. Now, my thinking of it is that that decision, Joffre did not want to revisit that decision of what he did in the beginning part of the war, which he would have had to have done if he'd have tried to argue why didn't we defend the iron ore area, because giving in to the fact that his grand plan was to take that whole area anyway with 1st to 4th armies.
And we're going to disagree on that, but we'll come to that later, Jim.
The other factor is involved is topology. It's a very difficult area to defend. If you look at the actual geology and topography of the area, if they'd have put units into there, with the strength the Germans had, which was demonstrated by 1st and 2nd Army being thrown back when they moved into Lorraine, they were just counterattacked and thrown back behind where they got to. Behind where they started from, the same thing would have happened. That any defence in there the same thing would have happened on either flank of that basin, and any troops that were trying to defend there, they wouldn't have even had to have attacked it because they would have just been trapped and cut off. So, yes, there are arguments as to why was it never talked about in terms of defending, but on the other hand, the idea that it would have shortened the war had they defended it, I will refute. Because I think the same thing would have happened if they hadn't, with the same planning that Joffre had. If part of it had been to defend the basin, they'd have lost the troops in the basin, because the whole thing would have gone wrong from 1st to 4th Army as it did, and they'd have been back towards the Seine, and even Verdun may have been in trouble then, because what you're talking about there is if you lose the basin area badly, you can lose Verdun because of where it's situated geographically. So there's all sorts of, I think it's easy to say, why didn't they defend it? And yes, what happened after the war was clearly lots of people trying to cover up non-decision making. And I think the non-decision was, well, we're going to be attacking anyway, in the same way the Germans were, so we don't have to worry about the basin. It'll take care of it because we'll be pushing the Germans back to the Rhine.
Yeah, and plus they weren't there to fight that sort of war. The French army was built around offensive and, more importantly, movement. They didn't have the heavy weapons to, come up against the Muslims.
Well, they didn't. But they didn't want the heavy weapons because it's a war of movement, isn't it? So that's why they've got the 75s, and you can, if they want guns, they can move fast because they're going to be moving fast. So, and the Germans wanted heavy weapons because they know they're going to be attacking forts somewhere along the line. But you can understand. I mean, I can see why they didn't defend it. If you're if you're working on the assumption this is all going to be over very quickly because you're going to attack into the Reichsland and Germany and that, and you're going to push them back and that's it. You're going to win. Fine, you don't need to. But on the other hand, what about the plan B? What about if it doesn't work? What about the industrial base then? If it doesn't work, then what do we do?
The question is then,
what a plan B.
Well, there wasn't a plan B.
But you always need a plan B, for goodness sake, always.
The plan B was the man, I suppose Jock would argue, but...
well, not really. I mean, he didn't plan on the man, did he?
No, well, he didn't plan... this is the point we come to the jet. Joff didn't have a set plan. This is what was going to happen. He looked for an opportunity to hit the Germans where he thought the weakest point, which way he moved. Fourth Army, particularly north through the mountain. We're going to come on this in a minute too. But he was after the war in Verdun. All he wanted to do was give his generals his army commanders the best chance to utilise the strength of the French, even though he wasn't aware of the full size of the German army, he knew even without all the extra reserves, there were a bigger fighting formation than his own army. So he needed to give what he thought, create a scenario where his army commanders would at least have a reasonable chance of inflicting sufficient damage on the Germans to disrupt their advance. But at the end of the day, it's all well and good. But if your troops aren't up to it, and more importantly, your army, your field commanders aren't up to it, you can have the results that they had.
So let me. I think this may be a good time, since we're talking about Joffre. We've been talking a lot about the French idea of attacking. I think it's time to talk about offensive outrance. So, of course, like as any general student of World War I will know, like the French had their vaunted Plan 17, which as Jim has been talking about, like the Germans are going to come in, and the French are, the Germans are going to attack France. Well, the French are going to attack right into Germany, and that's going to, and that's what's going to seal the fate of the war here. So, if I can just pose the next question here. Grandmaison's doctrine of offensive à outrance is now generally maligned as having led to disastrous operations planning and battlefield tactics on the French side in the summer of 1914. This was the belief of offensive at all costs, as it is often translated. Employing this doctrine, French field commanders sent hundreds of thousands of young Frenchmen into what turned out to be suicidal charges against machine guns and artillery. Is this doctrine much overblown, or was it indeed as entrenched as we frequently read? Was there any validity to it? And now with what you've been saying here, perhaps it wasn't so much this doctrine, it was more of the staff work that led to some of these heavy losses on the battlefield.
I'm handing over to Stephen here because his knowledge of that area and those first opening days is far better than mine.
My knowledge is primarily centered on the French Third and Fourth Army in the Ardennes, sort of Battle of the Ardennes, it's called, part of the Battle of the Frontiers. And the vast majority of those were encounter battles. They weren't really, the French didn't have any chance to employ offensive outrance. But just to go on more generally on the topic, most of the French army wasn't trained in it. They had the doctrine written down.
Okay.
But if you have a lot of things written down, but you're not practicing it, you don't train it, it's not going to be able to put it into practice effectively. What you did have a lot of was offensive spirit, which is a shorthand approach that, well, we'll just have a quick glance through the textbook, that's it. Oh, there's the enemy, charge. And that's what sort of the typical easy viewpoint is, but it's not giving the French officers sufficient respect, I don't think, because they don't go to Sancy or the École Supérieure de Technique, it's called, and spend several years studying warfare to think, oh, it's just somebody put on your white gloves and you charge. Okay, there's more. The fact is they weren't trained sufficiently with the men in the field to put it into practice properly. You read a lot about, oh, yes, that I mentioned about the white gloves. In the Third and Fourth Army field, if you work up the number of army corps in those two armies and break it back down to company level, there were approximately just over 1,000 companies in action. And each one of those are in charge. So there are only 3 documented occasions where that happened, where the Syrian officers put on the white gloves and charged. That's less than 1%. What did happen was there were a lot of unsupported infantry charges without adequate artillery support or machine gun support, which is actually, if you read the French doctrine and tactics at the time, that was what they were supposed to do, but they hadn't practiced it, so they didn't know how to do it properly in a lot of cases. Those that had experience in the wrong sort of war, if you pardon the expression, in fighting the colonial wars. When you come against another industrialized country, it's slightly different. If you get it wrong, you pay with your life because they've got the weaponry and the tactics, and as Jim said, to better train at the outset to inflict that damage. The Battle of Montjean on the 10th of August, Joffre, basically the French claims a victory, but at the end of the day, the 124th Regiment, I think, 120th, came off very badly. Sorry, 130th, my apologies. And they were rescued by General Cordonnier, who intervened. And the reason why they came off badly is they attacked without artillery support. He came in with his artillery and rescued the situation. After that battle, Joffre issued a memo which sort of said, basically, General must remain in effective control, mustn't advance without sufficient artillery support, must be adequate artillery and infantry coordinations, and so on. That was ignored on the 22nd of August, and he offered a very similar order after the 22nd of August. But you can't just tell people what to do when there's a million people to talk to. They've got to practice things. It's about education, training, learning. Just issuing an order, you ain't going to change things around. So going back to offensive outrance, it was hardly used in there because we're in counter battles. Most of the men weren't trained in it. Impact, did he have an impact? Tim Gale, in one of his articles he wrote for the British Journal for Military History, said, problem with the French thing, technology hadn't kept up with what the French wanted to do in a lot of cases. He was talking at that time particularly about tank doctrine later on in the war, but he also said it extended throughout the war. And it's true, because one of the things for offensive outrance, basically on a tactical level, you'd have a strong advance guard that would locate the enemy, fix the enemy, while the gross of the column manoeuvred to wipe out the enemy. Part of the doctrine was that the commanding officer of the division would lead either at the rear of the advance guard or at the very head of the following column. So, because of the terrain of the Ardennes, in Epes, for example, and also to a certain extent at Rossignol, the general commanding division got cut off in the village itself and couldn't get one of the brigades he lost touch with. At Rossignol, same thing happened. He was stuck in Rossignol, where the divisional column extended all the way back several miles past Saint-Vincent and over the hill. They didn't have the technology at that time to communicate adequately. If they'd had field radio, it's a hypothetical thing, if they had field radios, things like that, it'd been a different story completely. But in several cases, the general command of the division lost control of the division. And that's what I would say, my opinion, is the only real effective offensive outrance in the various encounters in the Battle of the Ardennes.
Yeah, I think when you look at First and Second Army, their advances in the earlier part, before August 22nd, I mean, they're quite successful. They do advance. Yes, the Germans of Sixth Army and so on, German Sixth Army, are told they're supposed to retreat. And that's a strategic type of idea because they're retreating in a way to create a trap for First and Second Army to walk into. So yes, they're advancing against an enemy that's in a way wanted to. But there are not the same sort of examples because it wasn't so much an encounter battle there. It wasn't the same thing as happening as Stephen. And that shows that at that particular stage, there was no real doctrine that was going wrong. I think what was going wrong, and I think it happened with the encounter battles as well, is that nobody really talked to each other. And how much that goes back, Christine, to whether these people actually didn't like each other.
Yes.
One divisional commander next to another divisional commander, they didn't talk to each other about what they're both doing because they didn't like each other or whatever it could have been. But whatever the reasons were, the armies became, even at the army level, they became separated. First and Second Army, the orders were a little bit then wrongly interpreted, which meant the two armies ended up heading in two different directions, which split the army, opened up the idea of where the Germans could counterattack. And as soon as the Ruprecht got permission to counterattack the Sixth Army, he did so, and the whole thing started to unravel for First and Second Army. But it didn't unravel because of any particular poor performance by the soldiers, or even down at a lower level in terms of them rushing at some attack or whatever. And in fact, when we talk about the battles later on, we'll talk about one particular situation where because the local commanders were good and because they sorted out the situation, they actually trapped Ruprecht and threw him back. So I think it's overblown. I think what we're looking at here, I think everyone's basically saying the same thing, that this whole idea is, oh yeah, the French had no idea what they were doing. They just thought if you just attacked, the theory was there. And the theory is just reinforced as over the fact that the artillery support, don't attack them without artillery support. But the competence of the commanders in the field just was not good enough. There was not all the time, but many of the ones. They didn't say, "Whoa, don't attack yet. The artillery's not up yet. We need to find support with the artillery. We need to attack with artillery first." There is then the problem that, and it really goes back to readiness of the war as well, is that doctrine idea about using the artillery fails a little bit with the 75 against German longer range, heavier guns. Because the idea is that the 75s take out some of the German batteries. But that's in almost the old-fashioned Napoleonic style, is that you bring your 75s up and they overwhelm the German artillery. The problem was the German artillery wasn't there to see, because it was behind the hills somewhere, and they didn't know it was there. And that's to do with reconnaissance. And the whole structure, it's staff work. It's reconnaissance. Where's your enemy? Where are they? The whole thing went wrong from that point of view, all the way through those, 5 armies, really, with Lanzerac's 5th Army as well. So it's I'm fully with Stephen there. It's not really anything to do with any doctrine that was supposed to be faulty. It was just a lot to do with other things, other factors, for me.
I think it's a hangover from Napoleon anyway, isn't it? This idea of French fury. Yeah. And it's one of the things that countries can sort of pat themselves on the back and say, oh, yes, but, we are the French and we do this. And it doesn't work once you've got machine guns facing you. So the commanders there were commanders who understood that. And I suppose there were those who didn't, or who thought that, French morale would overcome them. And that was a lesson they learned very soon, that it didn't. I mean, for obvious reasons. But I think it's a hangover. It's a hangover from Napoleon that suited the mentality of the time, I think. And I think also it did give commanders at the beginning a way of saying, we only lost because the men didn't try hard enough. And after all, you see that with Joffre's comments after the 22nd of August. There were failures. There were failures on the part of the men and the commanders, and there should be sanctions. Well, I mean, yeah, there were failures, but not failures on the part of the men. There were certainly failures on the part of the commanders. But I think this idea of if you say the all-out attack is what we have to do, and then it doesn't work, you can blame it on the men for not having attacked in an all-out manner. And I think they learnt very quickly that was not going to work.
Interesting comparison with the Napoleonic Wars, because that is what started to go wrong there for the French, in that they won so many battles by attacking a line with a column with just a simple élan. And it worked because the line broke. Yeah. But the moment they were against troops who, in that particular case, had also had a secret weapon in the fact they could fire very well with their muskets, it broke up the column, and they didn't have the strength of the troops. Yeah, and it is a hang-up for that. Almost an analogy to the Napoleonic Wars and the changes of fighting there.
It's sort of. I'm sorry, Steve. Sorry, no, I was just. I think it's one of these sort of pride things, that countries, and we do it as well in Britain after all, don't we? We pat ourselves on the back. Like today was a coronation and say, aren't we brilliant at it? We do this pageantry better than anyone else in the world. No one else tries. It's very easy to be number one when no one else is doing it. But we like to pat ourselves on the back with that. And I think certainly if you go back to the start of the war, there were French commanders and certainly politicians, I'm sure, patting themselves on the back, saying, "Oh well, this is la furie française, and we do this better than everyone else, and it's the Napoleonic spirit, and we'll show those Germans, we'll push them back into Germany." And then it doesn't work.
Steve, you were going to mention something?
Just about the musket fire, come back to training. One of the things about it was pure and simply musketry fire. Christina mentioned about the reasons they gave that men weren't. The other thing was the Germans were all dug in. They weren't. I say it's an encounter battle, but each German soldier had a spade. Each French soldier didn't have a spade. There's only so many per squad. A German soldier could dig a slit hole very quickly just to give them some cover. And they were better trained shots. And if you speak to anybody who's a student instructor, if you're untrained and you fire a rifle, you'll pull the gun up like that and you'll fire hard. The French complained that the Germans were all dug in because they kept missing them. And the reason missing was they were firing too high. It wasn't necessarily the dug in, it was a mixture of the foxholes and that. The Germans, on the other hand, were catching that. There was a study done of some of the corpses exhumed on the Verdun battlefield near Bellefontaine, and of where the bullet holes were. And the Germans that had been killed were all head wounds. There weren't that many of them. The French were all chest wounds, chest and stomach wounds, which just helps illustrate the fact that the Germans are firing much lower and better aiming. And even as far as September, that is still going on because General Rock, not the one who became the war minister, the one that got killed the day after, commented on that. My men are still firing too high. That all comes down to training and practice. So, just commenting on that.
So, what are some notable engagements or battles where the French performed fairly well?
Where are we? I mean, I just mentioned when we're talking about the First and Second Armies, the fact that if you had the right men in the right place, even before August 20, I can't remember the date of it's got various names, but I think I've got to read it because I always forget and I can't pronounce it that well either. The Trouet de Charme. Mm-hmm. Basically, Ruprecht and the Sixth Army were advancing into the area of Second Army, and Second Army was commanded by Castelnau. There you are, Alexandra. You wanted to mention, who probably of all the army commanders at that point was probably the best of them. And he was able to see that the Germans were actually putting themselves into a bit of a noose. The other thing he had a number of other very able commanders there. One of his corps commanders was somebody called Foch, and another one of them was Fayolle. So he had future army and even army group and even chief of commander-in-chief type level people there. And he was able to, without going into massive detail, create a situation where he allowed some of Ruprecht's Sixth Army to advance. He still had power on the flanks, and he actually was able to attack on both flanks and gave Ruprecht basically such a scare that it hurled Sixth Army back. So that's an example in the early part of the war. It didn't change the overall strategic situation in that First and Second Army ended up having to retreat, but that stopped that possible impetus, which might have been even more dangerous. Because if Ruprecht and the whole of the armies in the southern part of the battles, because we're talking about almost down into Lorraine and the Alsace and so on. And
right.
The Germans one of the German ideas was to advance through where the French had attacked, through the Lorraine area, and then actually pin French forces against the Vosges, the mountains, so that they were trapped. And if they had been able to succeed in doing that, then with all of what was going on in the north anyway, the French might well have been in real serious trouble. But it didn't happen, because First and Second Army actually managed to pull themselves together and fight that. So that's one example I have of where the Germans were not all powerful and where the French knew exactly how to coordinate. That was one of the first things they did, which they hadn't done before. But it needed those command levels. It needed people to actually show their level of command. Interestingly, on that way, if you look at Foch and Castelnau through the whole war, there's not great friendship between them or great respect of each between them. One of the reasons for that is that Foch gets promoted above Castelnau, in a sense, but also Castelnau had given Foch a command to not attack in one particular situation. And Foch was going to ignore him. He didn't actually, because he couldn't, because the Germans attacked first. But he was ignoring the order. So Castelnau was not happy with Foch in doing that. And so there's an enmity that goes through the war there. So if that's where that is at that battle where that enmity first arrives. But it just showed that the French had that capability.
Picking up on what Jim says, one of the points he made there was it was the commanders. If you give them a good commander, the French will do okay. So you had de Castelnau under them, Foch and Fayolle. If you go to the other end of the front, Lanzac, he had some damn good commanders in him as well. When you think of the people there, you Montjean, you've got Pétain, you've got Franchet d'Esprit. And if you look at some of those early battles to pick out, d'Esprit did really well holding back the Germans at Dinant. Because if Germans had got through there, they could have hit the flank of the whole of Fifth Army and by going to the BAF on the other side as well. So he did extremely well there. And obviously, when Lanzac went, he took over the army and those were all bumped up. So, yeah, but it's what we're picking as commanders. But these are commanders were in 1914, were still around in 1918. So they were pretty good. And that seems to make the difference. Because if the French were useless, you wouldn't have the man in a few weeks later. No one could just train on that much. Yes, they improved the training. But one of the key things that changed was the limogeage. And you got rid of a lot of the NAF commanders. Some were dead because they were they got themselves killed. And the rest were switched out and moved on. Now, it wasn't an ideal process. You can't say that 100% of all the commanders that got rid of were rubbish, and all the ones that replaced with were a lot better. But overall, you had better commanders in the right place for the job in hand. And what it did, as I say, it was August the 15th, Joffre was given permission that he had the absolute right to replace a commander without reference to anybody else. So he could do it. Now, it wasn't Joffre who recommended everyone to be replaced, because he didn't know that, all those commanders. So, your divisional commander recommend is inferior, his subordinates, and so on up the chain. And because of that, yes, there's a lot of political infighting, because we mentioned, Christina talked about all the various factions within the army. No doubt some took this opportunity to settle old scores. But by and large, you had a better set of commanders in place by the time of the Marne than they did in the beginning of August 1914. But at what a price.
Just thinking about sorry, go on. Just thinking about the Troy de Charme you were talking about. Castelnau and Foch had both commanded on the frontier, hadn't they? And knew it very well as terrain. And I've wondered sometimes whether, how much that was important. I would have thought it was, that they knew the area physically extremely well, having commanded troops there before the war for several years.
And Christina, if I can interrupt you for just a moment, I apologize. For folks listening, the Troy de Charme is an area that is between Nancy and Belfort.
Nancy and the Vosges,
Nancy and the Vosges Mountains. So we're talking very, very much eastern France on the old border with Germany, where I don't, off the top of my head, I don't remember if the border is close to there today, but in far eastern France. So sorry about that.
No, that's all. I just think that's one of the reasons why the battle there was successful for the French, because Castelnau had certainly he'd commanded on the frontier for several years before the war, and so had Foch. So they knew it very well. Whereas if you take Third Army, for example, General Ruffey, who was one of the ones who was sent to Limoges on the 30th of August, so he was in command for a month, but his entire army was formed on the 2nd of August. And it was an army. It was a particularly big army because it was supposed to be defending the frontier. I just wonder how that's a man who was given a command of an entirely new formation in an area that he didn't know, whereas Castelnau was given a command of and this is not a criticism, But Second Army, Castelnau knew he was going to command Second Army, and he knew the frontier, and that must have made a huge difference.
But that effect of Stephen brings it to the second of the sort of episodes as examples that I put in the notes, which was everybody talks about the 6th of September, which is basically the beginning of the Battle of the Marne. And it works because 6th Army is being created near Paris. It attacks the Germans in the flank, and the Germans retreat, as if the magic of 6th Army creates the whole thing. And that's not that is really trying to simplify the Marne far too greatly, and also oversimplifies the effect of the southern armies and how their part in the Battle of the Marne. It tends to be seen as they all just held their line. They turned round, held their line, while 6th Army then made the Germans retreat. 6th Army actually came to a standstill in its attack when it attacked into the flank. But it had worked because it meant that the Germans had removed whole corps of men northwards to deal with that threat. And that started the whole process. But on the other hand, in the southern part, there were still great dangers. And Joffre knew that. And that's why he created the new army of 9th Army. He'd recognized Foch's capabilities and put Foch in charge of that army. And basically with next to 9th Army, and there was a great battle. Foch was actually quite significant in the battles of 9th Army in defensive terms to stop the Germans breaking through the central part. The attacks was not just 6th Army, it was also 5th Army. And that was the 5th Army of Lanzerac that Steve mentioned earlier on, of the work there. And the same commanders were there, except this time it wasn't Lanzerac anymore, but Dethray had been so good in that particular part that he'd become the army commander. So he was now 5th Army commander, and he had in 3rd Corps a new commander as well in Hache, Emile Victor Hache, I think it is. In it, he had 5th and 6th divisions. 5th division was Maja. I know Alexander will tell me which way it's supposed to be said, but Maja. And 6th division was Pitta. And they were tasked with attacking. But they weren't just out with attacking. 5th and 6th division were supposed to attack and also support the corps on either side. But what was amazing and what was brought in there was all sorts of things that happened, because the corps commander, Hache, and also the divisional commanders had all sorts of things at their disposal. They actually had aircraft. They flew aircraft over to spot where the German batteries were. So the German artillery actually had something to fire at. They actually used the 75s in non-direct fire, which was not easy because it's a very direct fire type gun. But you can raise it. But they knew where to fire. He had liaison meetings between divisions. They liaised with each other in order to make sure that when they were attacking, each of the divisional commanders knew exactly what the other divisional commander was doing. Now, you can't say it's anything to do with the divisional commanders, sort of what they were. You can't have such different divisional commanders as Maja and Pétain. One thought of as a thoroughbred, pusher, shover, whatever, and the other as this careful, very thoughtful type of systematic. But they both worked under what Hache had brought in terms of make sure you develop your army or your division in depth, attack in depth. One of the problems with both the encounter battles in 3rd and 4th Army and also 1st, 2nd Army is that many of the divisions attacked on a very broad front with all their men up front. So that if it went wrong, you're losing men out of everywhere and you haven't got any support. So if you're counterattacked, you have no way of holding the counterattack. So when the Germans counterattacked 1st and 2nd Army, there was no reserves of any of the divisions that were attacked to counter that. They were all in the front lines, all being quite heavily, with heavy casualties because of the fighting that had happened. Now they weren't doing that. What Christina said earlier on about the fact that they were starting to do exactly, and Stephen, the idea was that everybody works together, and that finally these people started to make it happen. And the attack was quite successful. Not massively successful, but as I said earlier on, it shocked the Germans, because the Germans thought the Germans were actually just marching as if they were going to march down to the Seine, because they thought the French were going to continue to retreat. And all of a sudden, these divisions under very sort of active commanders got them going and got them attacking. So that was, again, the French could attack, they could do damage to the Germans. It was not, these are examples of where the French still had this fighting power. And that was the shock the Germans got.
And they were fighting on French soil as well.
Right.
But you talked about the morale thing earlier on. One of the things that's said about the whole thing of the attacks of Fifth Army and also the defense of Ninth Army is that Foch's Ninth Army, although they were not destined to attack, they were following Foch's idea that you don't defend by digging in, you defend by attacking. That shocked the Germans, but also morale rose in all of the French armies because all that they were, and you're right, Stephen, they were starting to fight for their motherland. They weren't just retreating, they weren't just under defeat, they were starting to fight back. So we forget how important morale is in armies.
Pick another point that Jim mentioned about the artillery cooperation with the Air Force. This is September the 6th, second week of September. The third week of August, that didn't exist. The Germans had it because there are incidents of German planes flying over and dropping coloured flares to direct their artillery on indirect fire. The French didn't have that in August, but by September they did. It just shows the pace of change and the pace that you learn when, as I say, your life depends on it. And gradually, that disparity between the French trained army and the German trained army is narrowing as they learn on the job. And that's an important factor in the victory at the Marne. Plus, as Jim says, better commanders to lead those troops in battle.
Because interestingly, it's another individual who comes in who actually gets hold of the aircraft to do that. And it's the artillery commander of 3rd Corps, who happens to be STN. And the smiles around the table there is he's the man who brought tanks into the French army later on in the war. So in other words, you have these thinkers, you have these men who have experienced those first weeks of the war and are willing to think about it, not just blame everybody for it going wrong, but think, this has gone wrong, what can we do better? And that's almost the business model of, what's gone wrong, what can we do better?
Sorry, go on. There's also what I call the puzzlement factor for the Germans, that it didn't work. And so, you've been trained to do something in a particular way and it's going to work. And then it doesn't work. And then now what do we do? Whereas for the French, they throw themselves at it and it doesn't work. And they have to think, okay, well, we've got to do something else. But they haven't got anything to unlearn. And the Germans have stuff to unlearn. And unlearning is hard. Yeah. And the first thing they have to unlearn is that this is going to be easy. And that the tactics that they've been training for and that were obviously going to win didn't work. They've got to unlearn that and then learn some new ones. And that's hard on the job. And that's actually harder than not having any training really, and then learning and then realizing you need some. Because the French are learning on the basis of utter disaster at first, but then very quickly after the Marne, there's a success there. So there's a morale boost, and they can see what works and they can go on. But the Germans are looking at what didn't work, and that's much more difficult to get past.
Yeah. And then they fall into the trap with that thought of, if this is not, we'll just move the armies further north and we'll outflank the French again. Yeah. We're good at flanking the French, so we'll just do it again. Yeah. And that's in a sense my third one of the French showing that they had learned and how they could actually coordinate and move and fight in that time and again. The French also thought they were going to outflank the Germans, but most of the time the Germans got there first. But the French were able to coordinate movement, which they weren't very good at the beginning, and fight hard to actually stop the Germans on the Somme. They stopped them at Arras. We're into October now, and then finally they obviously the British are involved, but it's the French, the Belgians, and it's a combined force that stops them at Ypres, stops them in Belgium. But it's always it's interesting when you read history. You have the Marne. And then usually in 2 or 3 sentences, plus sometimes only one sentence, it's sort of, there's then a race to the sea. And then it's first Ypres. It's almost as if, and it's an Anglo-centric thing, nothing happens between the end of the stagnation on the Marne and when the Germans dig in on the end, and Ypres, as if everybody just sort of like shuffles upwards and nothing happens in between. But there's some desperate fighting going on the Somme. They would have driven through the Somme in the same way they did in 1918, the Germans. If the French had to stop them, they'd have taken Arras. If it had not been for the fighting qualities of some units that were just thrown together. The Division Barbot was just a thrown together division, and there was one other division up there to try and stop the Germans. If the Germans had been as efficient as they thought they were, they should have rolled over those makeshift units, and they didn't. Which again shows that the Germans just thought they could just roll over anything that was in their path. And they found they couldn't in all of that so-called race to the sea, including First Ypres, as we talked about.
Well, when they found they couldn't, they're a long way from home, literally. So they extended supply lines, reserves, ammunition. The French are fighting on interior lines.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Yeah,
they've got a
it's much easier, isn't it?
A commander-in-chief who's an engineer who understands railways, understands movement and things like that. Once that initial plan had failed, it was going to be a long war. Because there's no way the French were going to give in whilst the Germans were on their soil. So, yeah. The Schlieffen people, some people still think the Schlieffen plan was a brilliant plan, just badly executed. It wasn't a plan for the 20th century, that sort of warfare. It wasn't going to succeed with that great leap curve around northern Belgium. It was just too long a stretch.
But it's also based on an assumption that the French are going to collapse, isn't it? So it's clearly something that grew out of the Franco-Prussian War, and the French collapse in 6 weeks. Well, I mean, they don't quite, because fighting goes on for the next into the next year. But the king abdicated after 6 weeks, the Emperor Napoleon III. So it's very easy to look at that and say, oh well, look at that, that's brilliant. We can do this again, and we'll get the same result. And that's always a disaster when people act on an assumption that something's going to happen and base a plan on the assumption. That's always a recipe for disaster.
I forget where I read it, but it's I'm thinking of the Arab-Israeli wars. Like the Israelis were very successful in 1967, and so they thought, like everybody trains for the last war, and so when like the various Arab armies launched their surprise attack, I believe it was in 1973, the Israelis were caught very much off guard because the enemy had they had learned their lessons and they had adapted, and whereas like the victors kind of rested like, well, I'm sure we're going to fight the same war next time. And
then they're no good. The enemy's no good. I mean, it's based on that. I mean, it's like Putin going into Ukraine, isn't it?
Yes.
The assumption is it'll collapse in 3 days, and then if it doesn't, what do you do then?
Yes, and I'm sorry I can't help resist, but I think we're on day 450 of our 3-day special military operation. So you need to check that ego there, guy. But Christina, it's actually just one more Ukraine comment. Like it's so in the previous episode, you made a comparison of Ukraine to France in World War I, like desperately trying whatever would work, like new technology, new tactics, new ideas. And I very much now when I look at the news, I follow that conflict. That is always in the back of my head. Like, like think about France. Like they're just, they're very much like France during World War I. So yeah. So as far as like the French being successful, I really feel I may ask Bart if he can like make a little inset with a static photo of Alex here, because he's just been like a part of this episode without actually being here. But I can't say I'm disappointed, but absolutely no mention was made of the taxis on the Marne and how they clearly won the Battle of the Marne for everybody. So I guess we'll just have to
All 2,600 of them, you know.
Yeah.
That was what they carried, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Out of the 150-odd thousand men in the Marne, or more. I don't know how many. If you take the whole of the Marne, I don't know how many thousands it was, but I think there were 2,600 carried in tax.
It was two. I think it was 2 battalions of the 103rd Regiment. That's all. That's all they took. But you imagine, the 600 taxis. 4 men to a taxi. 4 men to a taxi.
Yeah.
Where they're supporting machine gun, anything like that. Yeah. Even the most modicum of common sense, it's not going to be a significant contribution. Whereas Christina made a comment in the previous episode, it was more to do with morale and the French people, the Union Sacré, we're all in it together. It's like in Britain, people handing saucepans in the Second World War to melt down to make it to bombers and warships. It never happened, but people felt about it.
Yeah.
And in that way, it was important, and also for Gallieni's support.
Yeah, it was good press.
The material impact on the Battle of the Marne was negligible.
All right, so we'll move on. This is going to be our last question of the evening here. So we've talked about the French counterattack with the Marne, the erroneously named Race to the Sea, which nobody was actually trying to get there. They were just trying to desperately outflank each other. So how successful can we say the French army was at the end of 1914? So let's say we get to Christmas 1914, front lines frozen, everybody's digging in. We've got the first trenches scratched into the earth. The French had stopped the German invasion, but now they're sitting in trenches. So organizationally, was it successful in its operations?
I'm not sure what you mean by organizationally.
I guess as let's see if I can understand what I mean by this question. I apologize. So I think as an army, as an organization, had the French army done what it was supposed to do, seeing that they had stopped the German invasion, but of course the war is still ongoing.
I think they had stopped them. Go on. Sorry, Steve, go on.
I was saying, if you asked them on August the 23rd, they would have been very happy with the situation December 14. But if you'd asked them on August the 21st, they'd have been disappointed. That's how I would frame it. It was still in the game. I think that's sort of best we could say. But it was still in the game.
Yes.
The war was still going on, and the longer the war went on, first of all, the British army would build up, and then obviously later from 1970, the Americans would come in it. So the longer it went on, if the Germans didn't win those initial encounters, they were unlikely to win their overall conflict. So from that point of view, yes, perhaps they were happy and content, but at the beginning of August 14, they wouldn't have been happy with their performance. Certainly.
I think perhaps something that I was thinking of, did the French army, did Joffre and his and various commanders, at the end of 1914, were they oh, thank God, we've held them off, we've stopped, we can take a breather now, and then we'll figure this thing out? Was there any sense of that, or was there a sense of we've held the line here, we're frozen, but I'm pretty sure in the spring we're going to get these guys? I guess which line of thought was the most prevalent?
I should think it was that one. Next year we'll get them.
Okay.
Yeah.
They can be satisfied that they have not lost.
Yeah.
It's not the Franco-Prussian War all over again. They've held the line. France is, it's not intact, but there's a big chunk of it occupied. But they haven't lost, and so 1915 will get them. I think that's probably what they were thinking.
Reading Joffre's ideas and so on when it gets to late November, he already plans first Artois, which is basically around the Vimy Ridge area, which is not like second and third, much of a very large offensive. It really is to take the Germans away off the ridge of Notre Dame de Lorette Ridge, which is next to where the Vimy Ridge is, for those who know the area a little bit. And he wants them off there. And that's what the first Battle of Artois is all about. It fails, mainly because it's winter and it's not exactly the sort of conditions you can attack in. It was a horrendous sort of planning of attack. He already has in his mind plans for what becomes all the Artois and Champagne battles, which, I mean, basically that is the preemptive to what is going to be the discussion for 1915, is that as far as Joffre's concerned, the job has been half done. It's not what his objective was. His objective obviously was to win the war within the first few weeks, as was the Germans, because that was the thought process people had at the beginning of the war. But when realism kicked in to all sides, that this is not the same sort of war we've ever had before. You don't win by just having a major victory and the other side says, oh, fair enough, we'll give you this bit and we'll make peace. It was going to go on. His major aim then is to rid the country of the Germans. And that his mind must never vary from that. And the only discussion is how he then went about that. And that's the sort of discussion for 15. But he's already that's his mindset. As Commander-in-Chief, that's his mindset as the French. And his pressures from then on is all about where do I destroy the German army in order to break through and rid the country of that. And he doesn't move from that. He doesn't move from that all the way through the following year. So that is in his mindset. And he by then, as Stephen said earlier on, the whole emphasis moved away from the political control to Joffre's control, very much so, including other elements of the war when it goes away from the Western Front. He is very much more in charge, and it's up to him when things are going to happen. Nobody tends to argue against that. So the so-called miracle on the Marne, which wasn't a miracle at all, it was just a bit of good hard fighting by the French, but it did give him that reputation that led him into 1915. So I think, from my point of view, it's that sort of, I've done half the job. I've saved France. I've now got to defeat the Germans.
Steve, any thoughts on this?
No, I don't agree with what Jim was just saying there. The other thing about Baron Joff, once he gets the overall control of the army, he's also got the political aspect in his head as well. He knows he has to do sufficient to keep the Russians fighting on the Eastern Front. He's very aware of that. And some of his decisions, they shouldn't just go in isolation what's happening on the Western Front. It's Joff has that bigger picture in his head. He's carrying a lot of responsibility, and people sometimes forget that when he makes some of the decisions to attack, when perhaps he could have held back a bit, he is trying to keep the Russians on board all the time, because without them, he knows that the game is going to be up or very difficult, so to say.
Yes,
right.
Thank you. Yeah.
Right, and they would have known of the disaster at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes and everything by December. Yeah. All right. So I think this has been an excellent conversation. So we have found that Offensive Outrance was not as, pardon the pun, an entrenched idea as we thought it was. The French army did a lot learning on the job. Staff work could have been better, but I think what everyone here has indicated is that commanders on the ground very quickly adapted to the situation and started to coordinate and work together. And you had some, if not dynamic, then fast thinkers on the ground who could get in and sometimes fix messes that they were thrown into. So excellent. This has been an excellent.
Just in terms of the 14-15 drift.
Yeah, please.
All of that thinking that you're talking about there leads to what is usually, I'll not do the long French thing, is a note 5779, which just happens to be, it's quite a long descriptive way of how the French army is supposed to act. and it becomes the doctrine in 1915. But it stems from all the experiences that they've had in 1914. And within that document are some of the elements which are eventually regarded as the way that the Allies win the war. From the idea of combined arms, ignoring tanks because it wasn't thought of then, but the idea of combined arms of artillery, infantry, aircraft, even down to things like rolling barrages, even things like the idea of sending moppers up, in the English term, after the attacking troops, because you're going to have people who are in dugouts and so on who need to be got out of there, because otherwise they're going to shoot at you from behind as you advance. All of these things are in that note, and that's how fast the French moved in terms of what almost could be called amateurish beginnings that we've described earlier on in this session of August, where they didn't really seem to know what they were doing. Anybody seemed to, not because of a doctrine, but just because they really weren't trained properly to know what they were doing, to seeing how the war was eventually going to be won. It wasn't won for all sorts of reasons that quickly, but that embryonic foam was created within the 1914 battles. And I think that's if you want to leave a sort of French, what's the French 1914 legacy for the war? It's that learning process.
And that implies a self-confidence, doesn't it? That they can see that they're learning and that things work. And that document you're referring to came out in June, I think, didn't it? 1915.
Oh no, much earlier. Much earlier.
Did it?
It was already being used at Second Artois. It was
okay. As early as that. No, I didn't realise that. I came across it with a date of June 1915, so I didn't know it had come out before that. But that implies terrific self-confidence, I think, to say, actually to draw conclusions and to be able to pull the threads together and produce a document like that that really shows there are minds there really thinking about what's happening, what has happened, and how it can be used, and that's an intelligent army learning on the job and learning fast.
It's distributed in February 15.
Oh, as early as that? I didn't know that. Right.
The divisions have already trained with some of it. Not all. Obviously, it's one of the you pass commanders these things, but some of them just ignore them. But but you can imagine, you can see the thought process that must have been going on October, November, December, because something like that doesn't get printed straight away, doesn't get published, created straight.
It implies a terrific clearing out of dead wood, doesn't it? To get that far, that fast.
Both personnel and mind thought.
Yeah.
And as we said at the beginning, it's what Jofford started from 1912, but the war accelerated because he was allowed to, and he had to. It's just, as I say, it's shame it took the war to happen.
Yeah.
It comes back down to the training, lack of manoeuvres, and but we started at the very beginning. But picking on what Jim was saying, and Christine as well, to coin a cliche, it's the learning curve.
Yeah.
Talk about the British Army and etc. The French were there first, and their learning curve was pretty damn steep.
Excellent. Jim, just as what's the name of that note again? What was the title?
579. Oh, what's the French name for it? I've forgotten it. It's basically instructions it's in the instructions in the art. I'd have to look it up. I'm not quite sure if you look at 5779, it will have the full French name for it.
Perfect.
And English, which I've also forgotten.
5779. You got it. Excellent. Well, folks, oh my God, this has been, as always, a fascinating conversation. I've been taking notes. I have so much more to dig into now, going back to pre-war stuff and a lot of these early battles. So excellent. Thank you so much again for taking time out of your evenings to come on the podcast and to help shed light on the French army during World War I. I very much look forward to the 1915 episode because I think much like 1914, I don't think a whole lot is known about the French army in 1914 and 15. So especially these 1915 offensives like Second Artois and the Champagne battles. So yeah, I look forward to the next time we can all get together. I know summer's coming up, so I'll send out messages for when to plan for the next one. But thank you again, and I
Thank you.
Yeah, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.